You're all set to begin.
All right. Do you want me to kick us off, Marcia?
Sure.
So we now convene the meeting of the task force to analyze and make recommendations on issues relating to early childhood workforce development needs. We have a very packed agenda today. We have 3 presenters. And so we are going to just get started with our first presenter. After all 3 presenters are done, if there are additional questions that you didn't get to ask during the Q&A, because that Q&A period is so short, we want to make sure that you know that you can share those questions with us. We can share them with the presenters. And if you would like another meeting with your subcommittee with the presenters, we can try and schedule that if you have more questions or more dialogue that you need. Okay, so we want to welcome Lauren Hogan, who is here today to talk about the status, options, and opportunities for advancing early childhood educator compensation from a national perspective, including a few of NAEYC's key recommendations, and highlight the work that's happening in some of the other states. And I know that's been some of the questions that have been coming up for us across the meetings. Lauren Hogan is the Managing Director of Policy and Professional Advancement at the National Association for the Education of Young Children, with responsibility for a portfolio that includes federal and state policy and advocacy, higher ed accreditation, professional recognition, and applied research. She's developed and led NAEYC's nonpartisan early childhood policy agenda with a focus on centering educator voices, shared leadership, innovation, diversity, and equity. We're so happy to have you here with us, Lauren. Thank you for taking the time. I turn it over to you.
Thank you all, and I'm so happy to be here. And I swear this presentation is mostly going to be correct on the facts, despite the fact that today is not Wednesday, December 10th. It is in fact the 14th. So my apologies to kick it off with an incorrect date. Thank you all for having me here, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about the most important part of early childhood education, which is educator compensation. And we'll talk a little bit more about why the workforce is the most important part of early childhood education, and compensation is the most important part of the workforce conversation, which I know you all know already. I have the distinct pleasure actually of being able to give you guys a little bit of a preview this morning. We are getting ready to release our state-by-state data on our early childhood field surveys. The last one we did was in October of 2022. Your state data for Connecticut will be released later this afternoon. So since it was so close to when we were releasing it, I decided to build in a little bit of your data to the presentation today. So I'm going to name some of the things that we are seeing happening on the ground and some of the solutions that we can address. I think we all know that the problem is pretty clear, and what we're seeing is that families can't find or afford childcare because compensation is too low to attract and retain early childhood educators. And we know the staffing shortage is having real impacts. These are some of the impacts that we're seeing. And I'm sharing it this way to give you guys also some just data that you can use to make the case for the compensation investments. Because we don't have these compensation investments, we have a staffing shortage. Because we have a staffing shortage, these are the impacts that we're seeing. You know, fewer children are being served. We saw nearly half across the nation say that they were serving fewer children than they would like. That's about a third in Connecticut. 38% have a longer wait list because of the staffing shortage. That's about 35% in Connecticut. We're seeing these challenges in some ways mitigated in Connecticut, I think, because you all did such a phenomenal job getting the stabilization grants out, and we'll see the impact of those as well. That is mitigating some of the current crisis, but it is not going to mitigate the future crisis, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well. What we know when we're talking about compensation is that the stabilization grants in particular have helped. About a third of programs nationally and in Connecticut reported that programs would have closed without the stabilization grants. Nationally, about half of respondents to the survey said they personally received more money from a wage increase or supplement in the last year. This is up to almost 60% on the survey in Connecticut. And again, that is a testament to your prioritization of how you got the stabilization grants out and into the hands of early childhood educators on the ground. It'll come as no surprise when we think about what is going to happen when stabilization grants end. We know this is high on everybody's list of things that keep us up at night. 43% of child care directors nationally say their program is going to raise tuition. That's up to over half in Connecticut who say that when stabilization grants end, they're going to have to raise tuition. About a quarter nationally were saying that their programs will have to cut wages or be unable to sustain the increases. It's much higher in Connecticut, up to 42%. Again, reflective of the fact that so many programs did raise the wages and increase those salaries in Connecticut because of how you structured your stabilization grants, which is a wonderful thing and did enormous good in a lot of ways. And means that the pressure on the ending of stabilization grants and to keep those investments going through state and federal increases remains super important. Just want to put this in some context for what we're seeing around the well-being of early childhood educators. Like 80% of respondents to the survey are seeing that burnout and exhaustion are greatly or to some extent contributing to problems retaining qualified teachers. This is related to compensation. It's not exactly the same. Well-being encompasses a lot of different pieces that is inclusive of, but not limited to the question of compensation. We're not seeing a lot of folks say their mental health is excellent or even good. Only 40% of respondents could describe their mental health that way. And we know the impact that has on that question of burnout, on their relationships that they're developing with children in the programs. And nearly a third of respondents are reporting financial security in their own lives. This tracks with what we know about low wages of early childhood educators and the sort of financial insecurity and precariousness that exists in their own lives. Again, lower in Connecticut than nationally, in part because people had the benefit of these stabilization grants that were supporting their wages. There is a correlation here between people who saw mental health be a little higher in the programs where the stabilization grants were being used for wages. We are seeing some correlation. Causation obviously is very difficult to prove, but we are seeing correlation that makes us think that what we know about getting more money into programs and into the wages and benefits of early childhood educators has dramatic improvements on well-being, on turnover, on the quality and supply of the program. This is a scary slide. We have a major pipeline crisis ahead if things don't turn around. So we know we're already in a supply situation. This is what we're seeing nationally and in Connecticut around sort of folks who are thinking about leaving their job or closing their family childcare home. And I want to draw attention specifically to 5 years or less indicating that they're leaving or closing. It's up to 70% of folks in Connecticut who are saying they're considering it if they've been in the field 5 years or less. And that's higher than the national average, though national is high enough. Family childcare providers, minority-owned businesses is very high who are considering leaving. And we know what that would do to our field's celebrated diversity, how it would diminish the sort of options and choices for families, increasing educator turnover, adding to instability. And again, the number one thing that folks said they needed to say across the board is competitive wages. Again, surprising absolutely zero people. The issue is that compensation for early childhood educators drives both quality, and we've been talking about it in that way for a long time, right? Compensation is key to the quality. We know this. It's also key to the supply of childcare. And we'll talk a little bit in a minute about some of the other ways that policymakers may look to go about increasing the supply of childcare and why those strategies are misguided. Compensation is how we're going to increase the supply of childcare for families. And we know that's something that state leaders and community leaders, business owners are very concerned about, that supply of childcare for families. We're not going to solve it without attending to compensation. So how to get there with what we have now? This is just a couple of things that we're seeing happen in states. So increasing wages and professional benefits, right? We're seeing including paid leave, health insurance, retirement, loan forgiveness, childcare assistance for childcare providers, and substitute pools, which I'm counting as a benefit because I think it is one. If folks can't have access to don't have access to substitute pools, which are very difficult to come by. Hiring for full-time staff is hard enough. Hiring for subs, we hear over and over and over again, is very difficult. But without substitute pools, it's very hard to take advantage of some of the other benefits like access to higher education and sort of some of the other sort of long-term investments in the education of the workforce. We've seen a couple of really exciting innovations in the area of health insurance, in the area of loan forgiveness, and in the area of childcare assistance. So we did a webinar just last week, which we're getting sort of this recording and slides out about so that everybody can have them. Kentucky is the first state to provide categorical eligibility for childcare providers to ensure that they have access to childcare assistance by virtue of being childcare providers and not just by virtue of their income. So this is a benefit that really accrues to them. We heard for many years that early childhood educators were frustrated that they themselves could not afford childcare for their own children. That was something that came up a lot. Kentucky has taken some steps to address that question, and we know other states have been interested in that kind of approach as well. We've seen states from Washington, D.C. to district to Washington State think about providing subsidies for health insurance and utilizing the existing marketplace in order to do that. And so really thinking about how to take advantage of some of the existing policies that are outside of just what's funded within the Child Care Development Block Grant, for example. What exists for health insurance that we can tap into? What exists for loan forgiveness that we can tap into? And make sure that whether it's state or federal, our early childhood educators across settings know about and are getting access to things like health insurance and loan forgiveness, so that we're thinking not only about wages, but also about the professional benefits that should accrue to somebody working in a professional field like early childhood education. A second piece that we see a lot of states doing is Connecticut is one of these. So I'm not going to go into detail about this because Connecticut has done so much on this front already, but creating these compensation scales, aligning them with the professional pathways in the unifying framework, and then taking the next step to establish the cost of quality studies that are based on the compensation scales. What we don't want to do is create cost of quality studies that are based on the current pay for the workforce, because that's not going to tell us what it actually takes to provide quality care that is reflective of what's needed for the compensation of the workforce. So we see some of these pieces happening. New Mexico has been in the news a lot for what they've accomplished in terms of their state amendment for supporting access to childcare and some of the ways that they have used their funds. But honestly, Connecticut has also, I know it's hard to see some of the strengths within your own state because it still feels so difficult all of the time. At the same time, there are lots of other states and educators that are looking with substantial envy towards Connecticut and what you all have been able to accomplish in terms of getting supports in place for the workforce across settings. All of these pieces are sort of building towards the sustainable change that's needed, right? And states are using the federal relief dollars to support a lot of these, including, for example, Kentucky on the childcare assistance for childcare providers. They're using federal relief dollars to help fund it right now, collecting the data that they need to then make the case to continue moving it forward. So they're using the relief dollars to fund the program, they're going to collect both sort of the reach, what it actually costs, the benefits, and then sort of use that to continue to help make the case again at the state level and also federally. And I'm happy to answer questions about sort of what we're doing federally to continue the investments at that level in this work, despite the fact that we did not win Build Back Better funding for childcare within the reconciliation process. Some of the things that states can continue to do as we're building towards sustainable change are this sort of leaning in on the increasing access to benefits, right? Using these other systems and funding streams. And I've been beating the drum on income disregards for a little while because we have been seeing, and we know childcare providers are nervous about losing some of the benefits that they rely on to make ends meet for their own families when some of their wages and additional benefits increase. So income disregards are a way to address the cliff effect. They're used effectively in other systems like housing. Haven't explored them super in depth in early childhood education, but it is really something that I think states should be looking at and investigating further, because it's going to protect early childhood educators who are right on that bubble of income to be able to ensure that we're not making things worse for them while we're trying to make things better overall, and really giving them a path towards increased income that is sustainable over time. Creating stability and accountability. Obviously, the stabilization grants were intended to create stability. That is a key part of sort of why they were structured and supported and sort of sent out the way that they were. At the same time, we're trying to create stability over the long term. And there's a reason why, for example, classrooms in K-3 settings, Head Start classrooms were more stable than childcare in centers and family childcare homes. It is because of how we pay for the services in childcare compared to how we pay for them in Head Start and in K-12 settings. And that has a lot to do with what we call child contracts and grants in childcare, but otherwise are sort of known as just like funding a program. It is about sort of creating that consistency and expectation, the stability that allows programs to use those funds to invest differently in compensation over the long term. Then another way of approaching that is to think about paying license capacity rather than attendance, right? So that there is some expectation around incoming income for programs that allows them to invest more in sort of baseline wages and less just in bonuses, because bonuses are by nature reflective of sort of knowing that things might change, and it's hard to put things into place sort of for the long term in wages. If you're able to create more consistent stability and accountability, you're able to sort of think more about the wages piece. I also just want to touch upon this question of preparing for mixed delivery success. This is a longer term game, but this is a long-term process as well. Connecticut has done a wonderful job of investing in the education of the workforce as well, thinking about continuing to expand comprehensive scholarships and apprenticeship, and thinking about strengthening and expanding credit for prior learning policies. I know this seems a little bit sort of off the beaten path for a strategy for compensation, but hear me out for a second, because when we're talking about pre-K parity as a compensation strategy, which a lot of states are, if we have pre-K parity as a strategy and we don't attend to how we ensure comparable qualifications across settings, then we are relegating early childhood educators, especially those working with infants and toddlers, especially those working in family childcare homes and centers, to not have access to that compensation parity strategy. We need to make sure that we're attending to those qualifications and degrees in order to take advantage of that compensation parity strategy. So I really think credit for prior learning that recognizes the expertise and experience that our current workforce already possesses is a strategy, albeit a longer term strategy, for getting to that question of compensation and compensation parity. I just want to touch upon a couple of other pieces that programs and states can look at in the full bucket of the sort of preparation and support of the early childhood workforce, aligning with the professional standards and competencies for early childhood educators, supporting and funding these institutions of higher education around accreditation and quality so that we're able to really ensure, again, that we are moving towards a professionally prepared and compensated early childhood education workforce, and not towards what we know from 50 years ago, where a warm body is enough. It's not enough. It's not enough. We know that childcare is a workforce support. We know that a lot of people are seeing it that way. It is also and always a child development support, and really being able to hold these two at the times when it's hardest to hold those two together. We need to make sure that we're continuing to invest in the education and compensation of a workforce that is based on their skills, their competencies, and their value. That means investing in shared services and staffed family childcare networks so that we're attending across settings. This is about being inclusive of centers and family childcare homes and schools wherever kids are. Improving this equitable access to grants and contracts, right? We know that it is easier for some programs to be able to access stabilization grants and other types of grants and contracts. Really investing in data systems, shared services, hand-holding supports that really make sure that family childcare homes, smaller centers that don't have the sort of savviness to be able to access grants and contracts, that we are supporting them in doing so, that there is equitable access to these supports, and collecting and disaggregating data that tells us what and how we're doing. Just a couple of other pieces, and then I'll pause. There are a couple of links here in tracking the relief spending. This is from Childcare Aware, tracking some of the ARPA spending overall. The second link, and I'm happy to drop these into the chat as well, is from the Center for the Study on Childcare Employment at Berkeley, that is specifically tracking some of the work on states' compensation strategies. So both of those are great places to also go and see sort of what states are doing and responding in real time. When I said earlier that we were going to talk briefly about how states are addressing staffing and supply in ways that are not focused on increasing compensation, which are really the way to do it, just want to point out that deregulation is not going to solve the childcare crisis, but it will decrease safety and supply. So these are some of the pieces to look at around as we're thinking about what the strategies are for tending to the supply and safety and quality of childcare and early learning. We're pushing back against deregulation that actually creates a system and an environment in which educators don't want to work, and so are more likely to leave, and really making your staffing and supply shortage even worse rather than better. Raising revenue is, of course, a strategy and an opportunity. This is complicated in all states, but is something to continue looking at, because compensation costs money, and making sure that we're able to not back away from that reality and advocate at both the state and federal levels for the work to be able to invest the dollars in the education and compensation of the workforce that we need. So I will pause there and see if folks have questions. That's my email address. Feel free to reach out anytime. I'm going to stop sharing so I can see y'all. Hi.
Thank you, Lauren. Are there any questions? No questions?
I do have a question.
Okay, Georgia.
Hi, Lauren. Good to see you again.
Hey, Georgia.
Hi. So can you talk a little bit for me about what's actually happening in DC and what their thinking is? Because I think DC really presents an interesting model for Connecticut, because I think structurally DC can actually, Connecticut can actually replicate what's happening in DC. Because we do have the infrastructure to do that. And DC has two proposals And I think Connecticut is actually better positioned to do the second part of their proposal, which is their long-term strategy. So can you share with the group what DC is actually doing with compensation?
Yeah, I can share a little bit. And just to be clear, George is talking about DC's local work. Sometimes when we talk about what DC is doing, we mean at the federal level. In this case, we're talking about what the District of Columbia itself is doing for compensation. And I can talk just a little bit about it, and then I'm happy to direct you all to some of the reports as well, and some of the folks who are leading the work on the ground. We just had the opportunity to highlight some of their work at NACCE's annual conference. It was really wonderful to see some of the educators and policymakers come together. They have a pay equity fund. So this, one thing to know about what's happened in DC is that this has been built on multiple decades of sort of work to establish universal pre-K that went to the birth to 3 sort of legislation, that went to looking at how we're able to sort of support across states and settings, or across settings in DC, to be able to advance this compensation piece. So they're looking at their pay equity fund, and I will just, when I stop talking, link to a couple of resources that sort of describe it in more detail about how educators across settings are getting access to a substantial tranche of money. In some cases, it's 12,000. In some cases, it's 13,000 of like dollars that are coming to early childhood educators, and the sort of life transforming sort of pieces that are happening there. There's also a lot of work that they're doing to move there's also a health insurance piece that Washington, D.C. is doing. So it is both the wages and the benefit side, to think about how they're supporting and subsidizing the cost of health insurance for the early childhood educators, again, across settings in the community for those who are working in DC. And DC also deals with the regional aspect, which I know Connecticut, particularly in some of the spots, does as well. Maryland, Virginia, and DC are all sort of very connected, and people move very fluidly between the 3, thinking about how they're able to do this across sort of settings and make DC, I think, really attractive in terms of the recruitment and retention for early childhood educators. So there's the health insurance piece that goes along with the sort of pay equity and compensation piece. And then there's a longer term strategy around sort of the cost of quality, embedding the compensation in that, and really looking at the strategy that is inclusive, intentionally inclusive of birth to 3. They also did raise revenue. So they have a tax strategy in DC that really went to speaking about how they're going to fund this. And that was a big part of the sort of long-term question for DC. They worked as part of a coalition of folks who are working on raising revenue via a tax strategy for their wealthiest residents, and being able not only to sort of partner to raise that revenue, but also to make sure that that revenue is coming to the early childhood field as part of it, is a real strategy. We've seen that play out in some of the other states as well. Thanks, Georgia.
Thank you. Now, I know it might be very early in the process, but do you have any data about what the supply of childcare is in DC in comparison to the supply of childcare in the other states who haven't really taken this sort of approach to compensation?
I don't know that there's good data yet on sort of like, has it increased supply, or is it like, if there's, again, good causation data on that yet. Some of the dollars are just going out, but I think that is something they're tracking, and do expect to see, what you'd like to see is sort of the graph that like shows decline and people sort of leaving, money coming in, and a reverse in that, like, or at least a stabilization, so that you don't see that trend line sort of continue down. I think it'll take a little bit of time to sort of get and release that data back, since the pay equity sort of started this just in the last couple of months in terms of getting it out. But I think that's what I think folks will be looking for. And again, every state is both different and similar in a lot of ways. DC is unique in terms of how it's implemented some of its universal pre-K programs over the past sort of decade as well, and the impact that's had on the childcare community. But really being able to look at some of those pieces sort of, and how the compensation has changed whether and how the compensation initiatives have sort of changed frontline educators' ability to stay in the field, to stay in their programs, and to sort of continue providing high quality early childhood education over time, I think is something that everybody's going to be looking at very closely.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hey, Paige.
Hi, Lauren. I'm conscious of time, but I want to just put in the request of if you have any high-level examples of how people have been recognizing experience. Obviously, we could get follow-up from you about that, but we're working in subcommittees in part for this task force. And that's clearly one of the things we're trying to address. So if you have models that we can look at, or if you can just even name some ways that that's working, either the system is changing to make it work, or that it is working in a system. Thank you.
It's a great question. And I'll just, again, happy to have more offline conversation. We are working with a number of states in a cohort on some of the credit for prior learning questions. Vermont has a really interesting strategy, I will say. And I know they presented to our cohort recently around some of what they were doing for their credit for prior learning work. I mentioned to somebody recently that we were sort of deep diving in this, and they were like, oh, credit for prior learning is like the wild, wild west. It sure is. Shockingly, in early childhood education, like another wild, wild west, like out there strategy. But it is both one of those pieces that lots of folks are looking at well outside of childcare, right? Like the military looks at credit for prior. There's a lot of folks who are looking at credit for prior learning and what we can learn from them, and then how it uniquely applies to early childhood education, and how we look at that consistency where it's recognized not with like a badge that doesn't mean anything, but recognized with a credential or degree that means something in the context of compensation, right? And that's the critical component, I think, of the credit for prior learning strategy.
Any other questions? All right, thanks, Lauren.
Thanks, you all. Reach out anytime. And Jessica, I'll send you some of those references and briefs and resources, and you can share them out with everybody else as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Lauren.
Thank you all so much for inviting me.
Thank you, Lauren.
All right. Presenter two, Maria. Oh, great. Maria's here. She is a faculty member at Hunter College, and she is here to talk about her research on the effects of compensation on directors, teachers, and parents working and attending non-public schools in New York. So whenever you're ready, Maria, do you have a slides or presentation?
Yes,
I think
good
you should
morning.
be all set to share that.
Right, do that right away. Hi, good morning. I'm very honored to share my research with this task force, particularly because I am a deep believer that the perspectives of those in the field, the ones that are recipients of policy, needs to be at the forefront of the policymaking table. I am hoping that what I'm going to be sharing with you today would help you really inform your thinking regarding sustainable and fair compensation policies for the early childhood workforce in Connecticut. And I'm going to be focusing on my city, New York City, which I love, but it's a tough place to live in. And for early childhood teachers and educators, it has been really the grounds from a massive experiment, pre-K for all, which has been lauded as a tremendous success for opening the doors and access to 100% of all 4-year-olds in the city. But it also has faced several hiccups on the way, particularly as in the implementation of fair and sustainable workforce compensation policies. So I hope that what I'm going to be sharing with you today can be used as lessons learned and also a cautionary tale. I'm going to be piggybacking a little bit on what Ms. Hogan said regarding some recommendations, because that's exactly what kind of emerged from my study and my understanding of what happened in the deployment of pre-K for all in my city. So just to situate the research, in 2014, the city of New York embarked, as I mentioned, in an amazing experiment by securing $300 million in funding to expand their pre-K offerings, going from 19,000 seats in 2013 to around 75,000 seats by the beginning of 2021. And they were able to do this very fast deployment using a mixed delivery system. That means that they utilize what was already on the ground, the system that was already on the ground. So 60% of all seats in pre-K for all in the city are housed at non-public school settings, including early childhood centers like Head Starts or independent childhood centers and community-based organizations. And the remaining 40 are hosted in public schools. Unfortunately, as the expansion occurred, the city neglected to provide salary parity, so equal salaries, to those teachers with equal compensation in these non-public school settings and those in public schools. So it's easy to predict that what happened was a massive turnover, a massive exodus of teachers leaving these Head Starts, these community-based organizations, for jobs in the public school system. The salary differential was around $30,000 to $20,000 a year, depending of the different center. As someone that was a director at the time during the expansion of pre-K for all, I received calls in the middle of the night saying, I'm not coming back because I just got an offer at the DOE. And obviously, it was a very tempting offer. And I have to call several families and say that we didn't have a place for them the next morning. And most of these non-public early childhood centers serve parents that working parents, and they thrive in low-income communities. So the crisis that these decision-making caused almost destroyed the non-public school system, non-public early childhood system in my city. I would like to share from the voices of those that face these challenges. How did it feel at the time?
I always compare it to building a house. You can't build a house without the solid foundation. In Mott Haven, we are the poorest congressional district nationally, and only 1 in 10 children can read at grade level by 3rd grade. And so the foundation that we provide here at our early learning centers is critical to our children and to their academic success.
Salary parity is the tale of two cities. We have teachers who are certified the same way the Department of Education teachers are certified, master certified, state certified, early childhood educators.
And so from a teacher in a field, I make about $30,000 less than my counterpart at the Department of Education. I work summers, holidays, and I work on average 100 extra days.
It's very discouraging for the teachers in these community-based organizations who have worked just as hard, who have the years of experience. And it's very discouraging to have the thought of raising a family in New York City with as little pay as they're receiving.
My family knows that I'm a teacher, but when they ask me what school, and I'll say a daycare, I immediately get a look like, okay, that's babysitting. I think that's kind of the same way that we're looked at with salary.
I know that I'm worth much more than what a CBO can offer me. But my choice to stay with them is because I believe that, the first 5 years are important and that I want to give back to my community. So this way we can have strong and educated children.
We come here with a passion to want to teach and to want to work with children and help them in their growth. But at the end of the day, you have to survive and your family has to survive. The communities that are affected the most are inner city areas where these families are living in poverty. And of course, it is obviously people of color. We are the ones who are affected the most, yet we are the ones.
So the crisis reached a height in 2019. There was massive turnover and sustainability was at risk. In 2019, a coalition of advocates, unions, and teachers got together and threatened a strike in New York City that resulted in the passage of what the city called salary parity. So equal compensation for these two sets of teachers. And the deal was that by 2021, both NICEs, which are the non-public school educators, and the public school educators, they both will be paid $68,000 a year with a master's degree. So you may say, well, great. So now we have the solution to our problem. Not quite. I would like to argue that what the city proposed to the early childhood educators was what we call sub-parity. And this is a very important concept that I would like you to think and incorporate in your decision-making, because as we are thinking of expanding systems and supporting systems, we have to think about total compensation policies. And I think Ms. Hogan already kind of mentioned that. So what we currently have in the city of New York is sub-parity, which is compensation that is similar, but is not equivalent, where salaries are the same, but they are not prorated for hours or days, where benefits are the same, but they are not equivalent, or where supports may exist, but may not be accessible. And this is a concept coined by Whiteberg and McLean in the University of Berkeley. So to exemplify what this meant for New York City, let's look at the salary of certified teachers per hour. Before the salary parity occurred, New York City non-public school teachers earn $18 an hour, while public school teachers earn $61 an hour. By the time the parity was in full force in October of 2021, yes, there was an increase of around $30 per hour, still significantly less than what public school teachers receive. And the reason is why is because these teachers work longer hours and a longer school year. As you know, many of these centers serve working parents, which needs extended hours and wraparound services. That is the foundation of Head Start. So many programs are open 11 months a year. And then receiving the same compensation is simply not the same. Other issues with how this was crafted is the idea of not providing leadership parity. And again, this is a cautionary tale on thinking about compensation policies in a silo, looking just at one stakeholder in the system and not the whole system. Providing salary parity to one set of stakeholders, in this case, certified teachers, created another set of issues. In particular, directors did not receive an increase in salary. So many of them now earn less money than the teachers they supervise. The result, director turnover. So many of these centers now cannot keep their directors in place. This idea of longevity, I think it was mentioned before by Ms. Hogan, the idea that there's no recognition of the work that many of these teachers have done in these Head Starts and CBOs. They currently earning the same money than a first-year teacher at a public school. Providing this increase in compensation to this particular set of teachers also had a ripple effect in infant, toddler, and threes teachers, because they were not included in the parity. Therefore, many of them left their jobs to move into pre-K for all positions. The other piece that I think is very important to understand of how the effect of this policy affected the whole system is that during the years of the expansion, when CBOs could not find teachers to staff their centers, the DOE and the Department of Health allowed the centers to hire teachers under study plans. which means that these are teachers that are not certified, but they are enrolled in a higher ed teacher preparation program. These study plan teachers are not regulated under the DOE. They don't have guidelines, and they are basically at the mercy of the specific centers they worked at. They did not receive any of the salary increase. This is 50% of all the teachers in the system. Therefore, the compensation increase was really targeted to the very small number of teachers. So the ripple effect was, to a certain extent, not very felt in the community. So as we think about these total compensation policies, my research really tried to look at what were the experiences and perspectives of those working and those families attending these centers, and how do they perceive the impact of those policies. So I'm not going to bore you with my analysis, which is a little bit technical, but I look at documents as well as interviews from different stakeholders in the system. I analyzed documents from 2014 to 2021, and I collected 6 years of social media tweets. The documents included hearings, advocacy documents from different stakeholders. And I want to bring to your attention this idea of social media, because social media presents such an authentic take of what is happening in terms of the impact of policy on the ground. So as policymakers, I urge you to use social media as a thermometer of how the workforce is feeling. It's a very impulsive take on what is happening on the day-to-day basis. So the tweets that I collected for over 6 years included tweets from teachers, advocates, and as well as the Department of Ed and policymakers. In terms of participants, I interviewed directors, certified teachers, these study plan teachers that are the uncertified teachers that are enrolled in a higher ed program, as well as parents attending these non-public school settings. So what are the perspectives of policymakers, directors, teachers, and parents? There is this dissonant view between what policymakers perceive the impact of policy is and what actually the people living the policy perceive the impact is. And this is problematic because if we are not aligned in our views, then we cannot have appropriate strategies to solve problems. There's definitely a domino effect on policy. As I mentioned before, if you are only looking at compensation to one set of the stakeholders, there is a ripple effect on the system that can have adverse consequences. Total compensation matters. And I think Ms. Hogan already kind of touched upon this idea of benefits. I will also urge you to look at the total prorated amount of compensation, because that's what is really going to be making an impact in the quality of life of these teachers. Leadership and organizational advocacy matters. As it was discussed in the previous presentation, there are grants out there in which you can support these gaps, these disparities in the system. But for that, you need to have A, consistency in leadership. So you need to compensate your directors appropriately. And B, you need to have leadership that is able to take advantage of those resources and support those teachers that may need a special consideration given the population they work at. There is definitely geographical, racial, and setting differences, and this is not surprising. Other research has shown the same, especially in New York City, which is a highly segregated city. This means that there is a disproportionate negative impact on minoritized women. 80% of all the CBO teachers are women of color. And these are the women that have suffered the impact of these unequal compensation policies. The pandemic really exacerbated all these inequities. And I wish I had more time to go into the specific effects of the pandemic. But the bottom line is that we need to have continuous advocacy. In 2019, there was a fantastic advocacy movement, but it was not enough, because obviously there's so much work to be done at the ground level. I'm going to go back to this idea of these dissonant views between policymakers and those on the ground. And I want to bring to your attention the first kind of visual here, which is a media release from policymakers. Nonprofits are celebrating an agreement to implement salary parity in the early childhood education citywide. Meantime, below, you have a tweet from a director. This is all well and good, but for what the rest of and follow CSAs are the directors, the mostly women of color who lead NYC CBO's pre-Ks, they barely make more than the NYC teaching fellows of first-year DOE teachers. So you could see here that while the policy was meant to kind of improve the condition of those underground, there was still a lot of feeling of dissatisfaction underground. This was also reflected in my interviews. When I talked to directors and teachers about why did they think these policies occurred and the effect of and why did they feel that they were different, that they want the policies given to public school teachers, many of them believed that the DOE didn't value them. They didn't take their opinions into their policy making, decision making. For example, Karen, which is a study plan teacher, mentioned because they think we're just disposable, like babysitters. But I don't get it, because in the meetings they always say you are part of what makes pre-K for all, and they ask us to do the same things, but then they pay us so little. My document analysis also reflect that there is a sense of crisis and urgency, and that is really reflected from the beginning of the expansion of pre-K for all. And as we know, it reached crisis levels by 2019. After the salary parity was announced, this sense of crisis and urgency decreased, but then it went up again, started to go up again after the pandemic. What I want to bring to your attention is the different colors in the lines. The yellow line is the social media line. So as you can see, social media is the one that was the first one to identify there was a crisis in the system. And the only one that after the salary parity kind of kept kind of like the barometer of what was happening in an authentic level. So again, is this idea of, for those of you working in policy, to look at social media to see what really is happening on the ground. My interviews also revealed that there's a sense of crisis and urgency for those working in these centers. For example, this is Linda, a director in the Bronx. I feel like I'm having a panic attack every day. I don't like living paycheck to paycheck, and I don't like not having benefits. I don't have a voice. And this is after the salary parity already occurred in 2019. So my study showed that the lack of parity among directors really had an effect on the system. 57% of all CBOs and Head Start directors, particularly in the Bronx, which is the poorest borough in New York City, worried about their survival. 65% of all participants working in neighborhoods with low or low medium income levels felt a sense of crisis. And this is really explained by also how the distribution of resources occurred across the city. When I'm talking about resources, many teachers, directors, and even parents conceptualize one of the most important resources as time. I know that compensation is important, but many of my participants mentioned that they lack time. This is Carla, director from the Bronx, that says you can buy time. There's no substitute for time. And then she mentions that CBO Head Start teachers work these long hours, and there's no way she can compete with the Department of Education, in which the teachers are leaving at 2:30 in order to recruit teachers for her center. This disparities have many of the participants believe that these disparities came from some bias, a historical bias in the system, and that the advocacy, particularly for the unions, was not sufficient. That brings me to this idea of missing voices. In my study, I was surprised to find that the voices of parents were missed in the advocacy documents, in social media, and even in the hearings. The same thing happened for these study plan teachers. Teachers that are not certified, most of them are not unionized. And that makes sense now, because now they are the ones that really have no regulations in the system in New York City. So many of them are not covered in terms of compensation anywhere. So it is important to include these participants in our discussions on policy. This idea of sustainability also came about. The idea that these kind of half-baked compensation policies do not do much for the system. This is Karen, a director in Manhattan. We're still experiencing the same problems because it's not coming fast enough. And she is referring to fair compensation policies. Teachers, they want to be paid their work. So there is this recurrent theme of the need for longevity pay, for recognition for the years that these teachers had put on the field. There's also a lot of talk about the adaptations that these centers have done in order to survive. Hiring more study plan teachers, right? Hiring teachers that are relatively inexperienced, in which they're gonna be using these centers as kind of like the training ground, just to get their certification and move into the DOE. There's also something to be said about the commitment of certain teachers for these centers. And then we go back to this idea of leadership and directors that can inspire and provide these supports like grants to keep these core teachers despite the unequal compensation policies. One thing that I was really surprised, even though I knew it as a director, I saw it with my own eyes, but it was confirmatory of what I saw, is this idea that when we are creating these holes in compensation and they are not comprehensive, there are certain members of stakeholders in the system that will bear the consequences. So I would like to show you the testimony of Aries, which is a teacher in Manhattan. He is a teacher with over 25 years of experience working for a community-based organization. And he says, do we get a vacation? I have to breathe. I have vacation days taken from me because I don't go on vacation because my concern is those 20 kids. Sadly, they can't afford for me to take days because I am a licensed teacher. And generally, it's hard to get a licensed director. Remember, we're in the midst of director turnover. So if you don't have a licensed director, whoever has their license has to stay. You gotta be here. So again, going back to this idea of total compensation. If you have benefits that your teachers cannot access, they are not part of their compensation. So this particular teacher has access to all these days for vacation, but he cannot take them because otherwise the school will close. There's definite effects on classrooms and centers. Many teachers and directors report issues of classroom management, the inability to provide content, inability to provide small groups. And we all know that that's the best way for children to learn, in small groups. Inability to develop no instructional practices and assessments, and obviously burnout. My study also found that parents very seldom know about policies themselves, but they feel the effects of the policies. So parents knew that teacher turnover was happening, but they didn't know why. With the exception of Head Start parents, which Head Start has done a fantastic job communicating what was happening on the ground. So in terms of geographical and setting differences, as I mentioned, those centers that are in low-income communities tend to feel the brunt of policy. The same thing could be said for certain settings. Large community-based organizations and Head Starts are able to retain more teachers because they're mission-driven and they also have access to more resources like grants. However, unfortunately, these small independent childcare centers, many of them had to close because of the lack of appropriate staff. So just to wrap it up, some recommendations. We have to provide comprehensive compensation policies across the system. We cannot only focus on one stakeholder in the system because there is a ripple effect. And that has to include not only directors, teachers, and also support staff, but also teachers across age groups. Regulations need to be met with support. If we're asking study plan teachers to complete their degrees in 7 years, there has to be time release supports for them to do so. And there has to be some sort of recognition of the years of experience, despite the fact that they may not have specific credentials in higher ed. We need to build resilient systems. And to build resilient systems, we need to build resilient leadership. Director parity should be at the forefront of your discussions of compensation policy. The same can be said about training these directors to access those resources like grants, like it was mentioned before. And then creating a system of advocacy that doesn't die down with the first challenge. Some advocacy that is sustainable over time. So that is what happened in New York. I hope it can be of help for your decision making. Thank you.
Thanks, Maria. Any questions for Maria while she's still here? Oh, Steven?
Yeah, thank you,
Is your
Marsha.
hand up? Okay.
Yeah, it is. Sorry, I was trying to find the virtual button. Thank you, Maria. I really appreciate your presentation and particularly the voices and the testimonies that you presented. I wondered in all of that whether you feel that both on the question of how teachers feel they are valued or not, and worries about survival, whether that was exacerbated through the pandemic. And the other part to that question, how much of, filling the holes, as you referred to it, the gaps, even though it's at sub-parity, are one-time funds, and whether this is really are we going to go back? Are those graphs going to diverge again?
Yes, the pandemic really exacerbated these inequities, particularly, and again, going back to this idea of total compensation, resources, and resources should include supports. And in that pandemic, we saw this disparity of supports between public schools and non-public schools. So that increased that disparity, which unfortunately resulted in further turnover. At the time, we didn't feel that much because of the virtual world we were living in, so we didn't need as many teachers. But as we came back in person, that was magnified. The other thing that I want to mention regarding the pandemic, the community-based organizations and non-public school early childhood educators were asked by the city of New York to come back in person in August of 2021, versus public school had significantly more time to prepare to come back. So they were called essential workers instead of early childhood educators. And that kind of further that feeling of the other, being separate, being not part of the system. It made it more evident. So regarding the one-time payments, yes. So as we are nearing the funds from COVID relief, there's a lot of fear that the system may collapse because a lot of the expansion was funded through those funds. There is a lot of early childhood providers that are not receiving their funds. So even though they are supposed to get this parity, so is not only the policy in paper, but how the funds are depleted that are also being questioned right now.
Thank you.
Other
Hi,
questions?
Maria. This is Georgia.
Thank
And
you.
thank you for being available. I think I want to summarize what I think I hear you saying. You're basically saying, if we are going to do this work, we cannot just think about teacher salary or teacher wages. We have to think about compensation for all of those who are involved in the system. Because if you only address one constituent, then you are going to create even further disparity in the system, and nothing is going to be able to be sustained if you only prop up one aspect of the system and not all of the others. I think I also hear you saying that there is parity and sub-parity, and if we just look at paying teachers the same amount of money as public school teachers, rather than paying teachers equitably for the work that they do, then we haven't really created parity. We've created a sub-parity system.
And that's not sustainable.
Right. And if we do not build the systems of support in for people to access the other benefits that we're building in. And as I'm thinking about this, I'm thinking about even a family daycare provider, if they have access to childcare and they can now go to the doctors because they now have proper health insurance system. If there's not a substitute pool, then it's going to be really very hard for that person to leave. And if there's a staff and if we still have to meet ratio in a center, then a teacher or a director really also can't leave to access vacation time that we've built in. So I'm hearing all of those. Can you just state if that's what your presentation is really cautioning us to think about?
Absolutely. I think you summarized it perfectly fine. I think, again, this idea of having total compensation and how we are conceptualizing this. And I think this has been our mistake all along, considering wages as the sole measure of parity, when it's not, particularly because our early childhood system has so many different, particularly details for each kind of early childhood setting. So we need to think about this idea of prorated compensation and total benefits, including access to benefits. And I will include that into that package, this idea of intangible benefits that has been crucial to retain certain teachers, particularly in Head Starts. This feeling of providing an environment in which you can thrive as a teacher. And for that, we need to train directors. We need to train directors to access those supports for so they can sustain the centers and support those teachers on the ground. The other piece that I want to caution, and I don't know exactly, how Connecticut is dealing with this, but this idea of having the backbone of the system relying on uncertified teachers that need to complete their degrees, like in New York City, in 7 years, is very dangerous. And the reason why is because if we are not providing time-release supports to these teachers to complete their degrees, we're going to have a shortage in a few years. And that's what is starting to happen in New York City. There is a moratorium. There was a moratorium because of the pandemic on these 7 years. They have 7 years to complete their degrees. But those 7 years are about to expire. And what are we going to do? Then we will have to hire another crop of study plan teachers that are totally inexperienced. And if we don't have experienced directors to train them and mentor them, what is the quality of the programs that we are providing?
Thank you, Maria.
Other questions, Maria?
Yeah.
Okay,
Uh,
go ahead. Yeah.
So thank you for that. In Connecticut, we've had a requirement that programs had to get their teachers to BA degrees that has never been supported with money to pay them. And so we've instead just kicked out the deadline. It started off, it was supposed to be by 2015. Now it's by 2029, and nobody believes we're going to get there. Until we raise compensation, we're just not going to be able to keep people when they can jump to the public schools and get a higher wage as a paraprofessional than as an early educator.
Mhm.
And that's what's going on now. Programs are losing their degreed teachers because they're making $3 or $4 more per hour as a paraprofessional in these public schools.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's exactly what's happening to these study plan teachers. They can make more money working in McDonald's.
Yeah.
So Maria, as a quick follow-up to both, what do you're in higher ed, what do you feel the role of higher ed is in all of this?
So I think the number one thing, and I have another set of research that actually look at the role of higher ed for study plan teachers. The idea of providing sustainable programs that can address the needs of these teachers in terms of their time constraints that they face. Most of them work until 6 p.m. in many cases in New York City. So when do they have time to go to school? How do we provide creative ways to reach out to them? The online world has really improved, help us with that, but also providing Saturday and Sunday options for them. And honestly, using our voice with the state to encourage time release supports. And that's something that we need to start working on for these teachers. We were able to start a campaign in order to provide funding for their books, especially because I work for CUNY, which is a public university. But I think there's more to be done at the policymaking side, and we can just serve as advocates for this. Creating sustainable programs for them to finish their degrees. It's one of the things. One of the things that student plan teachers mentioned is to have administrative supports after hours. A little thing. We never will think that the register is staying after 5 who could support these teachers to complete their degrees. But are the little things, the little details become obstacles for them to continue in their degree. The other thing I want to mention is certification exams, by the way. I think that's a huge barrier for these teachers that are trying to complete their degrees. And New York State has gotten away from the ATPA, and we did a silent cheer in higher ed when that happened. And we are establishing our own certification exam that is more culturally relevant and sustainable.
Maria, this is Paige. I want to thank you for the work you're doing and presenting it here. It feels so important to see people and hear voices in it. I also really appreciate you underscoring the systems. And if maybe you could just say a little bit more about, it's not just about pipeline, and it's actually about successful completion, because that's one of my concerns in higher ed. Having worked a career in early childhood, everyone working in early childhood has a very complex life, multi-generational care and things. And so if you could just say any insights you have about not only having people come in but successfully complete, and you've named a few, but anything else you have would be appreciated.
Right, we have to recognize that these are students that need different kinds of supports. So the extended little things like extended timelines in assignments, the ability for them to complete their fieldwork requirements in their own settings or alternative settings that will not require them to leave their workplace. So we are starting now to provide Saturday placements. For that, we had to create programs for children so our student teachers could actually complete those fieldwork hours on Saturday. And the little things, as I mentioned, the idea of creating a system that supports them after hours. This is critical because they are, as I mentioned, they don't get out of work until 4 to 6 p.m. So we need to support these students where they are at by providing all these alternative ways of doing things, and also changing our mindset. We have to recognize the lived experiences of these teachers and the funds of knowledge that they bring to the table. So how do we build our curriculum
I'm trying to
so
figure out
we
how to turn off this.
recognize
Let me just move away.
what they contribute to the system? That's a major kind of mindset change for higher ed.
Well, part of our advocacy is what led to this task force being established and through legislation. So 100% agree.
Wonderful. Wonderful.
Any other questions? All right. Thank you, Maria.
Thank you so much. And I'm available if you ever need any resources. I'll talk more about this. Thank you so much.
All right.
Thank you, Maria.
Thank you, Maria.
Next up, Fran. Speaker 3, Paige.
Hi, yes, hi, everybody. Fran, I see you joined us. Thank you very much. Our third speaker is Fran Rabinowitz. She's the executive director of the Connecticut Association for Public School Superintendents, has worked in classrooms as administrator, teacher, has been an active interim superintendent as of recently as well, and is both advocate and support in this space. So we know that the early childhood space is birth through age 8, and we know that it looks like multiple kinds of credentials and certifications. And so we really wanted to make sure that we hear from Fran and her constituents here on the task force. Kay obviously being the flashpoint often, but we are really glad for you to come and speak with us and get some questions and answers today. Fran, thank you.
And thank you for inviting me. And unlike my usual presentation, I do not have a PowerPoint today because I wanted to be more anecdotal, but also to provide you with some data that I have. And so I as Paige said, I'm in charge of I'm the executive director for Connecticut Association of Public School Superintendents. I've been there for 4.5 years. I support superintendents and advocate for what they want for their districts, for their children at the state level and anywhere else I can. And I have been an advocate for pre-K for as long as I can remember. I'm probably going to say some controversial things here, and that's the way it is. You know, when you get to a point in your career, you know that you can just say things and you don't have to worry about your next job. So the first thing I'm going to say is I don't believe that we, and I think you'll agree with me, I don't think that we certainly compensate our pre-K or think about our pre-K in the way that we need to think about our pre-K because somehow or other, people think it's less complex to teach 3-year-olds or 4-year-olds than it is to teach 11th or 12th graders. And so we treat those that provide that instruction differently because we have this innate belief. You may not agree with me, but I do believe that there are many that believe that way. And what I would say to you is, as a superintendent and as an elementary teacher, spending a half a day in a pre-K class was absolutely exhausting. And I became very aware of the incredible skills that were needed. I was in Hamden as a superintendent for 7 years. I began many preschool programs there And I would have been hard pressed in Hamden to find one child that didn't attend pre-K. They all had it, either through public school or through private providers. Bridgeport was a different situation. I was interim there for 3 years, but the truth of the matter is I spent more than 20 years of my career in Bridgeport as a teacher and as an administrator. So I'd like to talk to you a bit about that. And then I'd like to talk to you about kindergarten certification. So I'm going to begin by saying that we had a very complex pre-K program. Many of our schools had pre-K with them. And they included pre-K. I think as for Connecticut, wouldn't it be fabulous if we thought of public school as beginning at 3 years old and had responsibility for our children from 3 years old on? Many of the countries that we look at and say, wow, they're doing phenomenal things, like Finland, they do that. They take responsibility from 3 years old on. That not being the case, we did push as much as we could for having pre-K as part of every school in Bridgeport. And when you do that, you are also compensating your teachers because they're certified teachers and they're paid as other teachers are paid. With that said, I would also say I had phenomenal community preschools, and what Maria was talking about, I can just magnify 100 times in Bridgeport. We had pre-K standards, we had pre-K curriculum. I had wonderful directors in those community pre-Ks who really wanted to advance their program and advance their students. And the problem was they couldn't leave in order to be trained or to get more networking with others, whatever it had to be. And that was a very rough piece forever. And, I think that the solution to that is complex, but it can be accomplished if we were compensating and if we really were believing in the necessity of an excellent program for our children from 3 on up, actually from birth on up. So that was, I will say, and it continues to be an issue today. I surveyed my superintendents, and as you can well imagine, the superintendents in the suburban districts are not complaining as much about the pre-K access for their students. But in many of the challenged districts, it continues to be an issue. I would also say to you that in the beginning of this year, from my understanding was there were 24,000 fewer students served in pre-K because we could not find the staff to serve them. And I think we really need to look at that. When I was at the State Department as Associate Commissioner, we were doing an awful lot with pre-K at that time. It's a while ago, guys. Jody Rell was governor, and we had Janice Grandel working on pre-K, trying to look at beginning the student ID, for example, at 3 years old and carrying it through, to looking at the effectiveness of pre-K programs, et cetera. I feel like it's fallen off a little bit in Connecticut in terms of how we are looking at pre-K. I would also say to you, one of the hardest things I learned, and I learned it with United Way when I was interim superintendent for 3 years in Bridgeport, I was constantly coming to the state and saying, I need more slots, I need more slots. And the truth of the matter is, I had enough slots for 94% of my students, but the slots were not in the right places, in the right neighborhoods, and parents and families didn't have the transportation. So I would say asset mapping is incredibly important, knowing where our kids are, knowing where the needs of our kids are, and knowing who our families are and how they want or how they can access those opportunities. And so I would say to you, we certainly have an awful lot of work to do with pre-K. You have a lot of experts on this call right now, much more expert at it than I am. And I would say to you that I'd love to hear what they think about, the public school pre-K, the community pre-K, and how we bring those together. I would say to the same standard. It's really hard when a community pre-K person who's doing basically the same work as a certified teacher and only making $17 an hour, if that. It's just not an equitable situation. And I'd love to hear more about how we might be able to change that. I would also say to you that while 2/3 of my kids in Bridgeport went to preschool, only 2/3, guys. I had a third that didn't attend. But when you did the kindergarten assessment for the children to come in as far as readiness for kindergarten, 70% of those students were not ready, according to the kindergarten teachers. So what does that mean? And where's the articulation between pre-K, K? How do we build more in terms of that articulation? I worry, I don't know the answer to this either. Beth Bai and I are very good friends and we argue about this all the time, but I find the kindergarten certification to be very curtailing, okay? I had teachers that were 4th grade teachers that really wanted to teach kindergarten and they couldn't because they were certified 1 through 6. The pre-K, K certification is not being sought by lots of people. That's the other piece. And I think higher ed could speak to that as well. I would also say to you that, the state said there were over 180 emergency certifications this year. And 150 of those were for kindergarten. So when that emergency certification goes away, where are we going to be? That was the emergency certification during COVID. Where are we going to be in terms of kindergarten teachers? And so I think we need to really absolutely take a look at that as well and take a look at the articulation between pre-K and K. And again, that articulation, I know from my own experience, is really hard to do if you can't free up a pre-K teacher from the community to come in and talk with kindergarten teachers. So I don't feel like I'm doing a line-by-line presentation here. I'm just giving you some of what I see as the issues, both as a practicing superintendent for many years and an administrator, and in telling you what my constituents, my stakeholders, my superintendents are telling me in terms of being able to find people. They're having a heck of a time finding preschool, and they are also having a hard time finding preschool special ed teachers that can work with these students. So I'll stop there and ask you to direct me or ask me questions. From my viewpoint, you know, I'm not an early childhood expert, but I am a systems expert, and I do know that until we have a robust pre-K in every single district, we are going to have children that are behind when they are entering kindergarten, and it's very hard to catch them up or accelerate them when they enter behind.
Thank you, Fran. We have like about 10 minutes or so for people to ask questions. I think we should start there.
Yeah.
That
Do you
would
have
be
any
great.
questions for me?
Thank you.
Can I ask you what you think about the pre-K, public school pre-K versus the community pre-K, or how do we bring them all together? I am not one to say that, gee, everything ought to be public school pre-K, because goodness, I had such wonderful community providers. So I'm not sure that that's the answer.
I'll just say one thing, Fran, just so you have context. This task force is working with subcommittees. One of them is working most specifically on compensation writ large, and then also looking at the higher ed component pipeline, what we know about that, as well as the certification, because we're trying to make sure we're paying attention to what the quality looks like, especially as being integrated, a real understanding of developmental needs and integration here in Connecticut, and making sure that we are honoring all settings, because we know different children's are served by those settings, and we want parents and community members to have that choice.
Right,
So,
exactly.
I know Beth's not on today, but everyone knows she would say that too, that's part of her commitment at the OEC. And there's a couple OEC people who might want to speak to that. So that's just the overview of what we're pulling together from the task force. I see, Meryl, you have your hand up, and then
Hi,
others.
Meryl.
Hi, Fran. So of course, the big concern that we have is kind of unintended consequences. Every parent would love to have childcare for free, like first grade and kindergarten. The issue is, if we pull the 3 and 4-year-olds out of the childcare system, the childcare system will collapse. There is
Correct.
not enough. You can't charge parents enough for the infants and toddlers to be able to support the infant toddler system. Every program internally subsidizes their infant toddler care with the pre-K care, because the ratios are so much different. And I was just recently hearing concerns about how California is implementing universal pre-K and how the impacts on the child care system. I am much more interested in how do we compensate early educators and create a viable way to bring them up to the same credential levels that public school teachers have. And I say viable, meaning one that actually works. We just heard from the previous speaker about all the difficulties that those study plan teachers were having actually achieving their degrees. And I can't tell you the number of directors who've told me, yeah, I'm told I have to have a qualified staff member in my school readiness program, so I have to have a teacher with a degree. The teacher I hired with a degree is so much worse than the person I've had working for me for 15 years who doesn't have a degree.
Thank you. Absolutely. Absolutely, Meryl.
You've got to be able to give people that credit for prior experience and prior learning, as well as making it actually possible for people to get the credentials that they need and get rewarded for it. As I said earlier with the last speaker, we've had a practice of saying you've got to get your degree, but we're not going to give you any more money if you earn it. And that doesn't work.
It does not work. And we have that. And Meryl, I can tell you 50 times over the wonderful people that I had in Hamden and in Bridgeport that didn't have a degree, but wow, what we all could learn from them in terms of being able to teach our children and teach them well. The problem is, I agree with you. The problem is the compensation for all of these, for all of what I consider professionals. They're professionals, and we are entrusting them with our greatest asset, our children, and they're wonderful. And how do we compensate them and provide the working conditions for them that are conducive to success? And it's not conducive to success to not be able to leave your classroom to go to the bathroom, or to never be able to leave to talk to other teachers and be trained. And, as Maria said, they work until 6 o'clock at night. So I would love to be part of that, trying to figure out a system to do all of those things. And you make some really good points in saying that, I'm not sure how we would do well with the universal preschool. I told you, I almost had it in Bridgeport, 94% of slots. And yet I only had 2/3 of the kids attending because it just wasn't well planned out.
Fran, Stephen and Georgia, and then I will call on myself. Stephen, Stephen and then Georgia, you both have your hands up. Do you mean to?
I think Georgia was first. Sorry, I was on mute.
I apologize. Thank you. Go ahead, Georgia.
Hi, Georgia, you're on mute, I think.
Still haven't learned to use Zoom, but
Yeah.
apologies.
No problem.
So Fran, you said you're a systems person, so I'm going to challenge you from a system perspective. Because oftentimes, I don't know, we've never met. Obviously I'm familiar with you. So my background is that I'm a director of a childcare center, and we're located in New Haven. And I would say a big part of our challenge is really connecting with, on a systematic level, with the public schools. And we oftentimes in New Haven find ourselves as competitors with the public schools rather than partners. And we're seeing more of that competition extending across the system, as even within the Birth to 3 system, the way that we talk about providing early care education for age 3 on up is within a context of the public school. So that drives this sort of continued narrative that the community-based programs for preschool program doesn't really provide quality care. And it's backed up by the fact that, or that narrative is backed up by the fact that we're not adequately funded. And even with the conversation around who are essential workers versus educators, I remember during the pandemic, many teachers, they cringed at the idea of being, teachers in the public school cringed at the idea of being called childcare workers. And they said it publicly, we're not childcare workers, so we're educators. And so, how do you envision yourself supporting a culture change, even in the way that we talk about early care and education? Because when we say pre-K, we sometimes think of pre-K very narrowly as 3 to 4 year old. And so for some people, pre-K is 0 to 5. We have to push back often on what is being required to occur in a 3 to 5 year old classroom because I see a lot of teachers feeling like if they're not teaching children to read or write or to do trigonometry, then they're not a high quality preschool program. And I oftentimes have parents coming in asking for us to get their 2-year-old ready for Yale. And it's just that sense of feeling like, we have to compete with the public school teachers to demonstrate that the work that we're doing is quality. And it's interesting that you mentioned that the teachers assessed that many of the children were not kindergarten ready when they came into you, even though they had preschool experience. And I want you to speak a little bit to that, but also speak to how do we change this culture? How do you help us to change the culture of what we're supposed to be doing in an early care setting, which includes a 3 to 4-year-old setting, and that we really shouldn't be replicating a dumbed down version of a kindergarten classroom, but rather creating those skills that will prepare a child to go into a kindergarten classroom ready to receive the instruction that that kindergarten teacher is going to deliver. How do you see yourself helping to change the language, to change the culture as it relates to the K-12 system in helping us to really redefine how we work together?
Well, Georgia, that is, it's complex and it's essential at the same time. Number one, I would say to you that I personally went through it in Bridgeport because I applied for the Smart Start programs, and they were public school programs. And my wonderful friends in the community-based program said, "Are you looking to put us out of business?" And I wasn't. I was just looking to get more resources in. If it could have been community, I would have had it be community. I think that relationships matter, Georgia. That's number one. I go back to that all the time. I also think that we have to understand and change the narrative and the articulation about what school is, that we begin school and grade in at 3 years old. I don't know. I'll leave the infants and toddlers to Merrill Gay. I remember him knowing so much about them. I don't know about the infants and toddlers, but I do know 3 on up. And I would say to you that the 3-year-olds, I don't care whether you're ABC system or you're in Wexler Elementary School, you are educating students. You are educators. And I agree with you. They're not childcare workers. You're educating. You have the preschool standards. I'm not interested in kids being able to read and write, but I am interested in them being able to self-regulate. I'm interested in them being excited about learning. All of those things I think are really incredibly important. And as a superintendent, I would have meetings with my school readiness council. I met with them often to be able to push out and have them understand that I felt that the 3-year-old programs, 4-year-old programs were incredibly important no matter who was running them. But that was me, and that's not enough. That's how I operated in trying to create a system. But I think I don't know that full answer to that, Georgia, to tell you the truth. I know that it's really important. I know that it's about relationships, but I don't think something should be built upon the fact that I know you and I'm having I have a good relationship with you, so you're part of the system. I think we have to build a system that includes everybody, regardless of whether I have a relationship with you. And I think we have to get through to superintendents, which I'm more than happy to do. And I can play that role in my position to get through to them, to network with them and talk to them about the full system and how important it is. I can't say enough about that. And I can't say enough about the readiness councils being incredibly important too.
Fran, I want to thank you. I know Stephen has a question. I want to just say we have about 5 more minutes because then I know Jessica and Marcia have a few more things. So I'll just put this out there because I feel like we could have another hour with you. An invitation to you and hearing one from you as well to continue these broader dialogues, including going back to what Lauren said, which is reframing our understanding of early childhood is not just about workforce. It's not just about schooling. It's actually about the development of the youngest people in our community and what that looks like for community. I'm restating that knowing we all know it and hope that we have opportunities to have further conversation. I definitely want to get to Stephen's question and then turn it back. And thank you for coming.
I would love that. I feel like my passion is released in this group because we haven't talked about it a lot. It hasn't been on the radar screen. We've been talking about how we accelerate our kids and after the pandemic, but we really haven't been talking that enough about preschool.
Stephen.
Hi, Fran. How are you?
I'm good, Stephen. How are you?
Good. So part of my role on this council is to oversee the subcommittee and basically around what's the role of higher ed. And I'm just going to ask a question or a comment, but we haven't got time, and I appreciate there isn't time to answer, so we will follow up to
Okay.
Paige.
Okay, Stephen.
But I just wanted to let you know we're also looking at the whole space of certification requirements, the role of higher ed, cert and credentialing. So we have been in a space of birth through age 8.
Good.
In that support. So we had the ECTC credentialing program. Meryl mentioned a moment ago that I know at Southern we've developed. Jessica Powell, who co-chairs this, was behind that very much. And then the time for completion of a bachelor's level degree was extended to 2029, and we saw the enrollments drop off. That's just an example of what have we got to do or work to be done in collaboration with OEC and CSDE to rethink the span of the grades, both from a early childhood development perspective, but also that we're not in a place where we're pulling from one pool from another, which we've heard today from the community-based centers to schools. We had a great presentation on this from New York, but also in the pre-K pull to K. So now there's discussion. We have a survey from K going back to elementary. So it was K through 6, then 1 through 6, and now it's K going back there. And you mentioned some of the demands in the emergency cert relief. We need to think through that as well, mindful of all this and what our role is there, whether it's ECTC, the 112 or the 113, or a new reconfiguration. And lastly, how do we integrate special ed into that? I feel that's another really important conversation. And that's why it becomes complex from a preparation standpoint, in addition to the other challenges around compensation. So I don't know if you've got any final comments. I know we've heard from superintendents about the need to pull kindergarten back, or whether that's unfair, and we'll follow up and have you have 1 minute to reply.
I will just tell you overall that the certification regulations are way too complex. Yeah. I say that to you based upon being an associate commissioner in charge of them. They're way too complex. I hold our profession in the highest regard, but I think we should strip back and say, so what do we need in a pre-K teacher? what exactly do we need? What do we need them to know and be able to do? And then run our courses and our certification accordingly. I know that's a big jump. And let me tell you, I had certification regs ready to go in 2005. All right. Change certification regs, and they're still sitting there. We haven't changed our regs in an awfully long time. And I think we really need to do that. Enough said, that's a huge job.
Fran, I will take that opportunity to loop back to our first speaker and say, yes, competency-based work is at the core of everything we try to do well in early childhood, and agree. I think many of us would agree, it would be lovely to see our regulations move in that direction from, I think Stephen, you always say our regulations are older than the students that we have in undergraduate programs. So we have worked. Thank you. Thank you.
And Stephen is open to it. Stephen's open, I think we could do this, guys, if we all sat around the table. There's enough wisdom to make that happen without ever lowering standards, perhaps even heightening them.
Our colleagues at CSD are behind this as well, and they understand that and are making.
They do.
Working in towards that. It's going to take time.
Thank you for your candor, Fran, for your time. And I want to make sure to pass it back to, I think, Marcia or Jessica. I'm not sure. Is there?
Yeah, we just have one agenda item and it's just discussion. Are there any discussions before adjournment?
Thank you.
Anybody? Thanks, Fran.
Just
our next. Go ahead.
I just had a question for clarifying. We have a report to submit to the legislature. Is that true? And what's our deadline? And are we on track to do it?
There is the deadline for first of all, the task force will end. The end date is January 1 of 2023. We do have a meeting scheduled for the 18th of January, I believe, and our final report will be due March 1st.
Okay.
We just learned of that maybe within the last week or so, if probably not even that long. End of last week, maybe. So yeah, that's
here, Marcia, because I can't tell if Jessica's really with us or not, that in the subcommittee chair conversation for Merrill, I think my understanding, like as a subcommittee chair, we have work to do to support that final report. And that we were going to have, I guess we have one more meeting, but our technical, these YouTube meetings, our official process has come to its short course.
Yes.
That sound right?
The subcommittee, I am here. I'm sorry. I apologize, everyone. As I mentioned, I do have the flu. So thank you all for holding down the fort. The subcommittee chairs and Marcia and I will be meeting next week to talk about the report, that the brief report that needs to be in for January 1st. And then we're hoping that we all can continue to convene as a working groups to compile that March 1st report that will be more comprehensive.
Okay.
And we did just learn about this over the past few days. We apologize for sharing this. What feels like at late notice.
Essentially, we've got some extension of time given how compressed this has been.
Yeah.
I would ask that every member of the council, we need to collect everyone's input, and we want to be sure the voice is heard. There's a lot of work to do in compiling. We've heard a lot, but it's gonna, we don't have much time, so we're going to try and help guide that process in collating and producing recommendations. It's going to be at the recommendation level. as most of the reports out of task forces are. So hope everyone can help us in our subcommittees as well.
Now, are there opportunities, or can you please clarify, excuse me, what the opportunities are to submit recommendations that could be included in the legislative session, in the upcoming legislative session? Is that something that's possible or no?
Our understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, Marcia, from our meeting with the senator, is that if we are able to follow this deadline of a brief report on January 1st and a follow-up report at the beginning of March, then we will be able to potentially be in this legislative session. Is that correct? Is that how that's the idea, is that we will be able to move a bill forward this session?
Possibly. There's a possibility.
I just
We can stick to the
don't
plan.
understand. I just want to clarify that for the group, I think we have all had a commitment to making sure everyone's voice and all the input is in the report, that we all have a chance to see it before it's submitted on March 1st. And so when you say the word report, Jessica, on January 1, it's my understanding that's can we call it an update? I don't just be, there's no official report going in on January 1 at this moment. The official report is March 1, which gives us those subcommittee times to move and work together and potentially have timely input. Is that?
Yes, I think that's correct. I think the idea is to give
That's
just
correct.
enough information to the committee so they can move forward with the idea of a placeholder bill, and then we will be able to update with more information and more comprehensive.
And I want to
report.
I just want to clarify the framework. So if the task force ends on the 1st, then what is the expectation for how the different subcommittees will continue to work?
That's something that,
The task force is no longer meeting after January 1, but we will work on the report until March 1. Right? That's
yes,
what I understand.
yeah, Jessica and I were going to meet with the chairs of the subcommittees to kind of discuss the specifics of that. Again,
Okay, so
we just learned of this Thursday or Friday. It was really late last week. But we, did meet, Jessica and I, and we've worked out, a couple of details. So our plan is to meet with the chairs of the subcommittees just to kind of go over some of those details, Georgia.
okay. And I see Alex's hands. I don't know if Alex has some more insight.
Yeah, hi.
Okay, yeah.
I just wanted to add that our nonpartisan office, OLR, can also assist with this report, and both myself and Rosalie could help with that offline and connect you with their office.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Alex. Any other discussion?
Can I just make the request that we have some sort of communication from you, Marcia, and Jessica as co-chairs, because it's 12:03 and I think we all just had a lot of questions. So can you give us a summative response at some point next week on timeline and things?
Yeah,
Yes, you can do that.
no problem.
Thank you all.
All right, I think we're ready to adjourn.
Thank you.
Take care,
Thank you,
everybody.
everybody.
Really good
Bye.
presentations.